Hi guys! So in this video, we'll do some small enhancements to our homepage just to fix some elements that we've left off from the last sessions. We'll also talk about the OData filtering, sorting, and grouping, and then we'll also tackle fragments for reusable content. By the way, if you are new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, make sure you stick around to the end because I'll show you how to determine filterable or sortable contents from your OData service. Alright, let's jump into it. As a review in our previous video, we talked about OData model as well as OData binding to update our orders table. And then we also tackled formatters, how we can transform our data and then display that data to our view. And we also talk about some basic debugging using our developer tools. Let's open up our i18n file and update our table title so that it binds to the correct label. So to do that, you can click on search and then open resource and then search for your i18n properties file and click open. In here, I'll just add a new entry called table title and set its value to orders. Okay, don't forget to save. And then also update our home view to use that translation. And in your table, update the table title binding. So instead of title, I'll use the i18n model and use table title. Okay, so make sure it's the same key from your i18n properties. Save and rerun your application. Alright, so our table title now shows orders. Our next enhancement will be on the currency code because as you can see right now, our gross amount is displayed without a formatting. It just displays a raw number. Okay, so to format our currency code, we can use the OData model type, which is the SAPUI model type .currency. This is a very useful standard formatter created by SAP to format currency using currency value and currency code. And it provides some parameters for us to fill in so that we can format our currency. And then that number format is providing us some format options, which includes different types of properties that you can explore. But what we are interested in here is the show measure false measure here. So we will not use the measure from the number format because we are already using the unit property from our object number control. Okay, so to do that, I'll go ahead and update our object number, gross amount number, and use the SAPUI OData model type currency to format the currency code. Alright, so I updated our object number property and using parts to bind the gross amount and the currency code, but I also provided what type of data are we using for this property, which is the SAPUI model type currency. And then I also added some format options on how to display that currency using the show measure false since I'm using the unit property already. If you are not using the unit property, you can leave the format options to true. Okay, so let's try to save this one and rerun our application. Now, as you can see, our gross amount is formatted using my local currency format. So if you're on Europe, there's a different currency format for that, and then if you are in the Americas, there's also a different format. Also, don't forget to beautify your code, so you can either right click your current editor and click beautify or use the shortcut command. Next is to add or limit the current items in our table, since if you load your application, you will see that there's a lot of items that being displayed out of the first load. So what we'll do here is to limit those items because we don't want the user to wait for a long time enable for the user to use the application. So there's actually a property for the table which you can set to limit the number of items. What we're gonna do here is to add those properties to our table control. So the first property that you need to enable is growing. Set its value to true. So next property is your growing threshold, and set its value, for example, let's set its value to 25. Okay, so what it does is that it will tell the table control that this table limits its item by default. So that's what the growing is saying on this true property. And then the next property, growing threshold, is just saying that I want to limit the items in the table by 25 items per bulk or per chunk. Just go ahead and save that one, then refresh your table. So if you have successfully set the growing and the growing threshold, if you scroll at the bottom, you will see that you'll have this pagination bar at the bottom of the table. So when you click this bar, the rest of the 25 items will be displayed. So it helps to speed up your application because you don't need to fetch everything, which is by default the default pagination is around 100 items. So now you are just fetching around 25 items. Alright, so we're gonna go and filter our table using our search field. So we're gonna add some source code to our home controller to modify the behavior of the search field. So on your home controller, inside the onSearch, because the onSearch is the event tied up to the search field, so we go to the search field and you will see that the search event is tied to the onSearch function. So let's go to the onSearch function. Let's add an event parameter to the function. So when the user types into the search field, we will receive the event from that action. So let's try O-event. And then for now, let's just remove the alert and add a debugger to our source code. Okay, save, and also don't forget to open your developer tool. I'm just gonna scale this developer tools up, and then type in your search field and press enter. You will see that the developer tools open the sources tab and our debugger or breakpoint is being highlighted. And from here, we can actually investigate the value of O-event. What you can do here while you are on breakpoint, so it only works when you are on breakpoint, you can actually type in, so let's clear this up. You can actually type in O-event in here, and this will provide you a lot of information with regards to the event. So you have your O source, which is the source of the event, which in our case is the search field, which is the field 0, and you have some additional parameters as well. The M parameters depends on the controls or the type of the event being triggered by the user interface. So what we are interested in here is the query parameter. And to access the M parameters, UI5 also generated a function for us to use. So you can type O-event.get parameters to get all the types of parameters from the event source. Or you can type get parameter and provide the key of the property that you want to access. So since we are on the search field and I want to output the query or the input from the user, I just type in query and you will get the value from the search field. And then you can just press the continue button at the top of the browser. Okay, so remember that we are currently using data binding on our table, so we don't need to manually crawl each item on the table and filter them manually by manipulating the UI. What the better approach is actually filter the data model of the control and use filters and filter operators so that the UI will just update based on the data binding. So we won't touch the control itself, but we are filtering using the data binding and the data model. So first, let's create a variable container. This will contain all the filters that we want. So for example, you want to add more filters later on. It will be easier for you to handle those collection of filters. Okay, and then let's also add a quick check if the sQuery is not empty. So remember that we get the query using the function getParameter. So var sQuery equals to oEvent getParameter query. So now our query parameter is assigned to the sQuery variable. So let's check that sQuery first, if it's empty or not. And then if it's not empty, that's the only time we'll create the filter object. So how can we create a filter object? So first, we need to create a new sap.ui.model.filter. Okay, so this object is our filter object. And then to provide information to this filter object, we need to provide few parameters. The first parameter is the property that we want our table to be filtered in. So if you go back to our ES5 service, if you go to our sales order, what we are interested in is to filter this sales order entity by customer name. So we need to provide that to our filter object, customer name. And then the second parameter is what type of operation we want to do. So to do that, we need to provide sap.ui.model.filter operator. Dot, and then this will provide you a lot of operations that you want or you can use for the filter object. What we are doing here is to search all the orders which contains our query parameter. So I will use the contains operation. And then we have already created our filter object. Our next step is to push this filter object to our array of filters. So a filters.push. Alright, so we're done providing the field that we want to filter and the operation that we want to do. The last parameter is the actual value that we're gonna use to filter the table. So sQuery. So we have a filter and the operation, but we never really link this operation to our model or our table. So the next step is to use the filters and update our table using data binding filters. So to do that, we need to first get the table. So let's assign table and then get the table control. So if you go to your home view.xml, you can do that by providing the ID of the table or the control and then use the command by ID. This will get the table instance or table control from the UI. And then remember that we are filtering the table using data binding, so we will not manually crawl each item, but instead we will use the data binding. So to do that, let's assign the data binding to another object. Then otable.getBinding. So this statement will get the binding or the aggregation binding items. Okay, so in our table, it will pertain to this aggregation. So it will get all the models, not the control itself, but the data model from the table. Okay, and lastly is to apply the filter that we've created, the filters, which contains the filter object, to that binding. That filter, then filters. Okay, so save and verify, refresh your application. Our application just loaded, and let's try to filter our table using the customer name. As you can see now, the table only contains all orders with customer name Teku. Okay, so let's also open our developer tools and try to search a different company. Let's search SAP. And as you can see in your networks tab, there's actually, if you open the batch operation and headers tab, you will see on the request below that it searches for sales order set, and then it passes the filter to the ES5 server using the substring operation and provided the one for the query that we type in our search field for the customer name. So you can actually play around here and try to search different companies. ES5 only searches using the exact case, or for example, if the customer name is all capital, you need to search all capital. So the case insensitive implementation is actually done on OData side, which is not covered by this tutorial. So let's clear our search. So it will go back to the original table results because of the squery or the empty filter that provides when the search field is clear. Okay, so let's just quickly go ahead and review what we've done here. So first is we store the query parameter from the search field, and then we created the filter object, and then we also provided the filter operation, and then we also provided that query to the filter object, and using O binding or the get binding items, we filtered the binding of the table and not the actual control. We can actually improve the source code by removing the static classes on our actual script. So what we can do here, similar to the formatter.js, is actually load the filter object as a dependency. So first, we can actually copy this class, then go at the top portion of your source code and paste that class, replace the that operation with slash, and then add the filter class. Same with the filter operator. So after that, make sure to provide the dependency as a parameter, filter and filter operator. And then you can now remove the static references. And as you can see, it's much easier to read. Then don't forget to save and rerun your application and test if it works. Alright. Topic is creation of reusable elements. So what are fragments? So fragments are like your lightweight UI parts or UI subtrees which can be reused, but they don't have really an exact controller with them. So why use fragments, and if you can use the normal view in the controller code? Fragments is very useful if you, for example, you have a dialog on your screen, and then that dialog contains a generic message that you can replace anytime you want with another message. So it's very useful for those cases that you don't really know, or you have dynamic content in your screen and you want to swap out those contents by your controller logic. Okay, so in our sort, in our group button, you can actually create a fragment for those, and then since it will pop up on the screen and it will provide options for us to pick our sort order and our group order, it will be very useful to use a fragment instead than to create a full view or a full another view or another page for that control. So what we're gonna do here is, in our project, you're gonna create a fragment folder and then create a new file. So right click, new file, and then type in sort dialog. fragment.xml. So this is the standard naming convention for fragments. You have your name and then the fragment.xml. So similar to our view files, you have your name and then the extension and the type of the file. Okay, so I'll just provide the source code in the description box below. So this is our sort dialog.fragment, and it contains a view setting dialog, and it has a confirm action which will call the onsort dialog confirm, and then you have your ID of this dialog, and it contains two items which is related for sorting the table, which is the sort items, customer name, and you have your gross amount. So basically you will show a line item for customer name, sort order, and gross amount. So we have a fragment, but we haven't yet loaded that fragment in any part of the screen. So the next step is to use this fragment in our home controller and load it when we press the sort button. So in our home view.xml, you have your sort button, and it triggers the onsort event when you press that button. So let's go to our onsort and just remove all the source code. Okay, so let's try to list down the steps that we need to do to load that fragment. So first step is actually to get the current view, and then load the fragment file, and then last is to open the dialog to show it to the user. Okay, so let's try to load the current view. So to do that, I'll just use a var oview is equals to this.getView. This will return the current view of the controller. And then next is to load the fragment by using the command fragment.load, and it accepts few parameters. So you have your ID, which is we will be assigned to the current view's ID, and then next is the name of the file that we want to load. So for us, we have our com.orders.order.app.fragment. It's under the fragment folder, and then we have our sort dialog. We don't need to provide the extension, it will be resolved by SAPUI5, and then we need to also pass the controller which will handle the events for this fragment. So I will just use this because we want the current controller to handle the events. Okay, so we're done loading the fragment file. Next is to actually open the dialog itself, but the fragment.load is actually asynchronous and uses promise or the JavaScript promise, so we can actually chain this with another function called then. And then inside the then part is actually another function, and then the fragment.load will call this script once the actual file is loaded from the network, and it will provide a copy of the dialog itself. And then we can now just open the dialog. So last is to import the fragment dependency, because we don't want any static references to our code, so we can just import this fragment at the top using sap/ui/core/fragment, and then assign that dependency as a parameter. Okay, so already done with the fragment load. Then we first created a view variable to get the current view and load the fragment by a fragment.load, and then assign the current view's ID to the fragment, and we also indicated which actual fragment file we want to load. And then last is the controller, which will handle the events on that fragment. So when we trigger the onsort dialog confirm, we can write that source code later on in our current home controller. And then lastly is using the then, because the fragment.load is asynchronous. We can use the then or the promise then to load or open our dialog. Okay, so save and rerun. Okay, so our application just loaded. When we click our sort button, it will open up our sort dialog. Right, so aside from opening the dialog, we also want this dialog to be automatically disposed by the lifecycle, because if you don't add the current dialog or the fragment to your lifecycle, you need to manually dispose the fragment. So for us to do that, we can actually connect this dialog to our root view, which is our current view, and then let the current view dispose, and the dialog will inherit the models and the life cycle. So view that add dependent, and then dialog. Alright, so now there's only one issue with this approach. So when you open your dialog, so let's also open our developer tools. So when you click the sort button, when you press the dialog again, you will encounter this error that adding element with duplicate ID. This is because the dialog has been loaded by UI5 and it uses the same ID once again, because it will go through our onSort function again and will load the dialog again from the network. And the problem is that your ID, the being provided or the generated ID, will conflict that it's already appended or it already exists in your DOM tree. So to prevent that error is actually, let's try to make a check. If the current dialog is loaded, we don't need to load it again. So first, perform a check if the ID of the sort dialog already exists. So how do you check for that? If this that by ID, then provide the ID of the sort dialog already exists, don't call or don't load the fragment again. Instead, we want to open that fragment. Sort dialog. Okay, so what we've done here is to check if the fragment on the second time it goes through the onSort function. If it already exists, don't load it on the network, but instead just open up that fragment. This is also a performance enhancement because you don't need to load the fragment from the network, so it reduces or it caches the fragment rather than recreating the fragment itself. Okay, so let's try to refresh our application. Okay, so let's try to click our sort. So the fragment's loaded on the network, cancelled, and then it opens up again. And we don't have that duplicate ID because it doesn't load the fragment from the network, but it uses the cache of the fragment. Okay, so the next step is to actually add sorting logic so that this fragment is able to sort our table. Okay, so for us to do that, we need to implement the OK button, or in your dialog fragment is the confirm event. So let's create this function, onsort dialog confirm in our controller. I'll just add this below the onsort function. Similar to our filtering, let's add an OEvent parameter. So we will catch the event parameters from the OK button. And then let's just add a debugger for now to investigate what are the parameters that we can use for our sorting source code or sorting function. So let's try to click our sort dialog, and then let's choose customer name and then click confirm. So now you are on breakpoint. While on breakpoint, so let's clear this up. Type O event. So you have your source, which is the sort dialog, and then you have your parameters as well. As you can see, we have different parameters from the search field that we have a while ago. And then to get the O event parameters, we can again trigger via O event get parameters. Okay, so let's investigate. What we are interested in here is the sort item, because the sort item contains the property or the key that the user selected. So as you can see, there's property in here and it's selected to true, which means that the user pressed the customer name on our sort dialog. Aside from the sort item, we'll be also interested in with the sort descending, because this is the flag if the sort order is descending or not. So we can get that by get parameter sort descending. You can see you can get the value of sort descending, and then you also have your sort item. Okay, and so we have the sort object, sort item object. If we want to get the properties, the selected property, we need to get parameter sort item, then get key, because we are interested which key the user press on the sort dialog. So you have your customer name. So given all this information, we can now proceed to our home controller and implement our sorting. So in our onSort dialog confirm, let's retrieve the sort item first. So to retrieve the sort item, we can assign it to an OSort item. Then from the source code we tested on the console, we can event that get parameter sort item. Okay, and then let's also query the column that the user inputted or selected from the sort dialog. So it's a good practice to set a default column just in case the user didn't select anything or it's been reset in the dialog. So for us, we'll reset the sort order to sales order ID. So the sales order ID is the property from your ES5 OData service. Let's also store the descending order. So var b descending. So how can we get that parameter? It's O event dot get parameter sort descending. Okay, and similar to your filters, we can create an array of sorters. So it will be very flexible for us to add new sort columns later on. Okay, so we have our basic variables that we need for us to sort, because we have the sort parameter from the user. We also have the default column that we want to sort and the sort order. Next is to create the sorter object or the sort object. So first is to check the OSort item. Let's just make sure that it's not empty, because if it's empty, it will just default to the sales order ID. If the user provided or selected a column from the UI, we can now then get the sort key. Okay, remember that the get key will return you the selected column from the sort dialog. And then let's create a new sorter object. So new sorter, and then the first parameter is your column that you want to sort. So it's column path, and then you also need to provide the descending order, so which is our B descending. and then this sorter will need to push this to our A sorters. Okay, so now our A sorters will contain the sorter object. Again, so instead of filtering the control, we are actually filtering the binding of the control. So to do that, again, similar to your filtering, you can actually copy this one, paste it on your sort object, and then replace the A filters with A sorters, and then replace the filter keyword to sort. So don't forget to import the sorter object as well. So basically just can copy the filter object on your dependency and then rename this one with sorter. Then also don't forget to provide the parameter. Then beautify. Okay, so our application just loaded, and as you can see, the customer name is not sorted. So let's try to sort ascending. So you can see now the sales order table is sorted by customer name. See, you can also check the network and search for the OData query. And you can see there's a request for sorting the sales order set by 25 items and ordered by the key that we've selected from the sort dialog, ascending. So let's try to sort by descending, then gross amount. So you can see it's sorted by gross amount, descending. You can open up your network down below, have your sales order set, and then gross amount, descending. Wow, now that's a lot of coding, but don't worry, we are near with the final topic of this video, which is grouping. And good thing about grouping, it's basically similar to sorting. You only just need to provide additional parameters to your sorter for the grouping to work. Okay, so this time, instead of reusing the fragment sort dialog, I'll just want you to be familiarized with creating the fragment file. So I'll just need to create another fragment file in your folder, but you can actually pursue and reuse this fragment if you want. And then I'll name this new file as your group dialog.fragment.xml, and then copy paste the source code from the description box below, and don't forget to beautify your source code. And you can see you have the same event confirm, and then this time the ID is group dialog and the group items instead of sort items, and you have your customer name, so we will group the table by customer name and status. You can just actually copy paste the sorting dialog fragment loading and replace the values. So here in our on sort, let's copy this one and paste it on your on group and just replace the IDs, because this one should match the group dialog, and then replace this one because we are loading now the group dialog instead of the sort dialog. And also don't forget to change the else part. Okay, so you can actually save this and rerun our application. Make sure it doesn't have the error ID, duplicate error ID. Actually, we can just copy our onsort dialog confirm, and then since it's very similar, we just need to replace the onsort with ongroup dialog confirm. And then this time, we will use the group item because we have the group items here, group item. And then still need to default to sales order ID because we want that. And then instead of sort descending, we'll use the group descending property. And now we will introduce a new variable called bGroupEnabled, and then set its value to false. So this variable is basically a flag if the user provided a group selection in our dialog. So if the user resets the group, for example, if the user press the reset button, we can actually just remove the grouping from the UI. Okay, I think everything is good, but this time what to do is on the third parameter is actually add the group enabled variable. Okay, so we provided the sorter object, the column, and it's sorting by descending, and then the grouping enabled. And to set or update the group enabled, we just need to set its value to true. Let's go back and review the source code. First is the standard sort process. You just replace them with group, and then we introduce a new variable. So by default, there's no grouping. If the user selects from one of those items with group by, sort item will have a value, and then we'll just update the key or whatever key the user selected, and then we also enable the group enable. And then what we added here is just basically added the group enable to the sorter object. Okay, so let's try to save and rerun the application. Alright, so let's open up our group dialog and then try to group the contents ascending by customer name. And as you can see, now it's grouped by Avantel, African Gold. Customer name ascending. If we try to reset, since we defaulted to sales order ID and we set the group enabled to false, it should clear out the grouping in our UI. So as you can see, it returns back to sales order ID sorting. Since it's very similar to sort, it just disabled the grouping. And if you check your network, you will see that the request is actually an ordinary sort request. There's no specific to the group filter because the grouping is actually done by the OData model on your UI side. So as promised from the intro, I'll show you how to determine the filterable and the sortable contents on your OData service by reading the metadata document. Okay, so on your open OData metadata document, so if you open your OData metadata document, then scroll down to the sales order, because this is the entity that we are interested in, you will see that in the properties, there's actually a filterable and sortable property or attribute. And it's set to false for this one. So the note is not sortable or filterable. So by default, if the attribute is not here, it is true. For example, sales order ID doesn't contain sortable false. So it means that the sales order ID can be sorted and filtered. If the attribute is present on the XML or the OData metadata, it's actually the element is not sortable or filterable, or it's basically disabled for that property. Okay, so before adding your grouping and sorting and filtering to your UI, make sure you consult or you check with the with your OData service that the filtering is enabled by default or not. Alright, our homepage is almost finished. We have completed our filtering using our search field. We have our sorting as well and our grouping. So in our next video, we'll work on navigating from the home page to the details page. We'll set up a simple application navigation in preparation for the details page. So we are now closing in to our final application output, and I appreciate you for your support, guys, being here for throughout the part of the series. So there's a lot that we have covered and there's a lot to be covered yet. So please don't forget to subscribe. If you like this video, leave a like. And if you have any questions, just comment down below. And that's all for this part. And I will see you in the next one.